In the 1st century after Christ, in a small room in Rome, a young man sat with a shattered leg and an unshaken mind. His name was Epictetus, and he had been born into slavery in Hierapolis, a Greek city under Roman rule. From the moment of his birth, his body belonged to another man. He could be bought, sold, beaten, or maimed at the whim of his owner. And yet, centuries later, emperors would read his words like scripture, and free men would weep at his teachings on liberty. How does a man in chains become one of history's greatest teachers of freedom? The answer begins not with his release from slavery, but with something that happened long before it. A lesson learned in pain, delivered through the very hands meant to break him. This is the story of how a broken leg became the foundation of an entire philosophy, and how a slave taught the world what it truly means to be free. Epictetus served a man named Epictetus, a former slave himself, who had risen to become a powerful secretary to Emperor Nero. Having once been owned, Epictetus now owned others, and by many accounts, he ruled his household with cruelty rather than compassion. Epictetus, though young, had already begun studying philosophy, sneaking lessons from the Stoic teacher Musonius Rufus whenever his duties allowed. He absorbed ideas about virtue, about the difference between what a man controls and what he does not. But philosophy in his mind was still just words, untested, unproven. He believed calmness was possible even in suffering, but belief is easy when life is gentle. The real test was still ahead of him, waiting in an ordinary day that would become extraordinary through the actions of an angry master and the silence of a patient slave. According to the account preserved by the historian Origen, and later expanded in Stoic tradition, one day Epictetus grew angry with Epictetus over some small matter, perhaps a delay, perhaps disobedience. The details are lost to time. In his fury, he seized an iron implement, perhaps a leg screw used for punishment, and began to twist it against the young slave's leg. Most men in this position would scream, beg, or weep. Epictetus did neither. He simply looked at his master and said, calmly, almost as if discussing the weather, "If you keep doing that, you will break my leg." It was not a threat, not a plea. It was a simple observation, delivered without fear, without anger, without resistance. Epictetus, enraged by this composure, continued anyway, twisting harder, until the bone gave way beneath the pressure. The leg snapped. Bone broke beneath iron. And what did Epictetus do in that moment of unbearable pain? He did not scream in agony or curse his master's name. Instead, according to the story passed down through generations of Stoic students, he simply said, "See, I told you so." No fury, no hatred, no collapse into self-pity. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a fact he had predicted, delivered with the same composure he would have used to note that it had begun to rain. This single sentence, spoken through unimaginable pain, would become one of the most quoted moments in all of Stoic history. Proof, lived out in real flesh and blood, that a man's mind could remain free even while his body was being destroyed. This moment reveals the very heart of what Epictetus would later teach the world. He was, from that day forward, permanently lame. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. His body had been broken by another man's rage, but his mind, his judgment, his inner will, what the Stoics called the proheresies, remained entirely untouched. Epictetus could control the iron rod. He could control the bone, but he could never control how Epictetus interpreted the event, how he reacted internally, what meaning he assigned to his own suffering. This distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us would become the central pillar of his entire philosophy, one he would spend the rest of his life teaching to anyone who would listen, free or enslaved, rich or poor. Eventually, likely due to his growing reputation and perhaps even respect earned through his composure, Epictetus was granted his freedom. Some accounts suggest this happened after Nero's death, when Epictetus himself faced political danger and his household was reorganized. Whatever the exact circumstances, Epictetus emerged from slavery not embittered, but transformed. He did not seek revenge against those who had owned him. He did not spend his newfound freedom chasing wealth or comfort. Instead, he devoted himself entirely to philosophy, studying under Musonius Rufus with a seriousness that soon outpaced his teacher's other students. He began to understand that his years in bondage had taught him something free-born men rarely learned, that true freedom was never a legal status. It was a state of mind, and no law, no master, no chain could grant or remove it. Epictetus opened his own school in Nicopolis, in northwestern Greece, teaching students who traveled great distances to hear him speak. He owned almost nothing, a simple mat, a lamp, a modest hut. He never married, believing his mission demanded total devotion. His lectures were not written by his own hand. Instead, a devoted student named Arin sat among the crowd and transcribed his master's words as faithfully as he could, producing what we now call the Discourses and the Enchiridion, or Handbook. These texts, born from a slave's spoken wisdom, would go on to shape the mind of one of Rome's most powerful men, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor himself, who studied Epictetus's teachings decades after his death and carried them with him even onto the battlefield. Here is the detail that stuns those who first learn it. Epictetus's most famous teaching, the dichotomy of control, was not born in comfort, safety, or careful philosophical reflection in a quiet study. It was forged in the exact moment his leg was being broken by the hands of a man who owned him. He did not develop this idea gradually over years of gentle contemplation. He tested it in real time against real agony, and it held. Most philosophy is written by people describing suffering they imagine. Epictetus wrote about suffering he had actually lived through, bone and blood and all. This is why his words carry a weight that few other ancient texts possess. They are not theory, they are testimony. Years later, Emperor Domitian, fearing the influence of philosophers on the political order, banished all philosophers from Rome. Epictetus, once a slave in that very city, was now exiled from it as a freethinker whose ideas were considered dangerous to imperial power. He did not resist the exile with anger. He simply packed his few belongings and traveled to Nicopolis, where he would spend the rest of his life teaching. Consider the strange symmetry here. A man who had once been forcibly kept in Rome against his will was now forcibly removed from Rome against his will. Yet in both cases, his response remained the same: complete acceptance of what he could not control, complete devotion to what he could, his own judgments, his own choices, his own inner peace. In Nicopolis, his school flourished. Students came from across the Roman world, senators' sons, merchants, soldiers, even the occasional slave, all sitting together on the same benches, drawn by the same hunger for a mind that had proven its philosophy through fire. Epictetus taught them a radical idea for his time, that external rank meant nothing when it came to the health of one's soul. A senator and a slave suffered from the same illusions, the belief that happiness depended on things outside their control, reputation, wealth, other people's opinions, even their own bodies. He taught that the only path to genuine freedom was recognizing this one boundary line, drawn clearly between what belongs to us and what does not, and living entirely on our own side of it. One striking teaching he offered his students captures this perfectly. He told them, imagine a man throws your body into prison. Fine, he said, your body is not entirely up to you anyway. It can be sick, injured, aged, imprisoned regardless of your wishes. But your mind, your will, your judgment about the event, that remains untouchable, sealed off from any external force, so long as you refuse to surrender it. Even his own broken leg, he would later joke to his students, was simply proof of concept. He would tell them, with characteristic dry humor, that his lameness came from rheumatism, downplaying the brutality behind it, treating even his own suffering as something not worth excessive attention, because attention given to what cannot be changed is attention wasted. Marcus Aurelius, decades after Epictetus's death, would carry a worn copy of the philosopher's teachings with him during his brutal military campaigns along the Danube frontier. In the quiet of his war tent, surrounded by plague and violence and the crushing weight of ruling an empire, the emperor would write in his own private journal, what we now call Meditations, echoing Epictetus's exact language almost word for word. You have power over your mind, not outside events, Marcus wrote. Realize this, and you will find strength. Think of the strange justice in this. A man born with absolute power, ruling the largest empire on earth, found his deepest wisdom in the words of a man born with no power at all, a man once considered less than human under Roman law. Epictetus died sometime around the year 135, in relative poverty, having refused wealth throughout his life despite his growing fame. He left behind no property, no fortune, no monument. What he left behind instead was a way of thinking that has survived nearly 2,000 years, quietly shaping minds far beyond his small school in Greece. His words would later influence Renaissance thinkers, Enlightenment philosophers, and even modern psychological therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy itself borrows directly from his central insight that our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. The iron rod that broke his leg 2,000 years ago still, in a strange way, continues to shape how millions of people today are taught to manage anxiety, grief, and fear. So what does this ancient story mean for us now? far from Roman chains and Greek lecture halls. Consider the moments in your own life when something breaks, a relationship, a plan, your health, your pride. In those moments, we often behave as though the event itself is the source of our suffering. But Epictetus, tested in the most brutal way imaginable, showed us something different. The event is simply the event. Our suffering comes from the story we tell ourselves about it, the resistance we throw against what has already happened and cannot be undone. The next time something in your life breaks, and something eventually always does, remember the slave who watched his own bones snap and said only, "I told you so." Ask yourself, what is actually up to me here, and what is not? Then place your energy only where it can still make a difference.